Leonard and I would joke that Todd Bogey had the smallest head we had ever seen. It was as if the birth never fully recovered from the vagina smushing of birth. It bobbled like the largest of heads, giving Bogey an air of almost inhuman tenderness. An innocence pervaded everything that Bogey did, as if his tiny head taught him that nothing lasts very long. As the rest of us stood stiff in our Russian Orthodox cassocks, Bogey's head would wobble out its humility in the incense-smoked air of the church. The weekly touch football matches were held on the only flat green area on the campus of our little seminary in Crestwood, on the outskirts of New York City. Leonard and I were the best, Bogey much less so. The sun was an obstacle one particular Sunday after the morning homilies and various long-standing events. The details don't matter so much, but the denouement does. Leonard and I rolling around on top of each other at the end zone by the pitiful creek. He had two-hand grabbed more than two-hand touched me, and I lashed back and barreled my way through Leonard and across the imaginary goal line. I felt momentarily triumphant rather than ashamed. Leonard felt differently, pushing me over from behind. There were devilish words sacrificed into the sacred air of the seminary as we worked out our salvation on the ground. Leonard was strong and I was bruised, but no amount of ice or heat would soothe the sting of watching Bogey put down the football on the 1-yard line and walk away. The inflated, stitched pigskin wobbling to stillness on the sunny grass. Leonard and I made up emotionlessly the next night as we leaned against each other, imperceptibly relieving one another of the tedious weight of Father Tom's long homily. In the Russian Orthodox Church, everything is done standing. Leonard and I joked that the sheer difficulty of enduring this particular strand of Christian religion surely guarantees its validity. The long-standing must please the Father. The next time Leonard and I wrestled, Bogey joined in. We were a couple of beers into a Friday evening in Nyack, Leonard 5 or 6. The waters of the Hudson called to us. The cooling, foggy air drifted over the sea wall. As we approached the stone embankment, I signaled to Bogey to nudge Leonard into the water before he'd fully derobed. I was sure the motion and angle of Bogey's head formed an affirmative, and conscious assuaged, I did. But Leonard was fast and got hold of my wrist. I toppled him over into the black water. My misfortune canceled out his, and the whole event turned playful when Bogey launched himself onto us with a guttural roar I didn't think him capable of. We rolled into the water deeper and deeper until the sand disappeared from our feet, and nothing mattered but the feeling of skin on wet skin, of getting a good deep breath in between the plungings. We were suspended then, taken out of history in the dark blue water, somewhere in between children and adult. For a moment, I pictured us from underneath, 3 thrashing figures, gurgling laughter, the silhouettes black and playful in the remaining light of day. Part 2. Bogey and I touched down in a storm at night. It was raining hard. The runway in Managua was leery and puddled as the 747 insisted upon it. We had never traveled together before, and Nicaragua was first for both of us. My Spanish had been honed some years earlier from an undergraduate semester abroad in Costa Rica, where I stayed with a coffee farming family. Bogey's Spanish was non-existent. We overpaid for umbrellas at the hostel and walked into the night's wind and water. Almost immediately, we were trailed by a small band of Nicaraguan children, fascinated by the Americans and unconcerned by the tropical storm. "Me gusta, gringos," the biggest one with a hat said, smiling through the water on his lips. "Mira, mira!" pointing off westward towards the old center of Managua, the Palace of Revolution. We had greasy chicken tacos and ice cream, shadowed by the smiling children, sparse-toothed. Somewhere in the night, the roles were subtly reversed, and we followed as we were beckoned around corners and out into the great square. The ruins of the old cathedral lay where the earthquake had left them, a carcass of concrete in sacred shapes. The silhouettes of the crucifix steeples flashed in the lightning against the black sky. I imagined in my emotion that I could see goosebumps rising on Bogey's head. Something so great, hulking and majestic, laid low and somehow made better for it. I put my hand on his wet back, and we shared a little piece of meaning tossed down from the table of God. We followed the children into the outer halls of the structure. The light from the square and the flashes from the storm disappeared inside the walls. The heaviness of the place, drawing the light out of the air and into itself. Somehow, as we gaped and awed, the children melted playfully into the walls, or grew into teenagers and young 20-somethings blocking our retreat and our advance. The brick facades stuccoed once were calm, the red shadows holding the cat's nests and the homeless piles. There were petty weapons and gestures that suggested more significant ones, but all I could think of was the story of it all. The rain had been perfect, the smiles so genuine, our desires so masterfully manipulated, the umbrellas, our protectors, the streetlights so well lit. For me, it meant an hour of a Portuguese nurse picking glass out of my upper arm and stitching me up. For Bogey, it meant 2 months of easing his broken ribs back into the habit of protecting his lungs. It was the beginning of his spiritual calling. The dark shadow of that street-turned alley for him represented a darkness waiting for light. After a week in the Managua hospital, Bogey's father came and took him back to their home on Long Island. I decided to spend the last days of my trip at the Great Lago. There I devoured the poetry of Nicaraguan Jesus Dario, whose books I'd purchased on the day of Bogey's hospitalization. Bogey told me about Jesus the night before our flight to Managua, a product of his pre-trip research into Nicaraguan culture. His head slowly flicked from side to side like a compass needle as he described the mythic figure to me over drinks at our favorite dive bar in Nyack. The monastery, as it was called. By the end of the night, we were spitting gin and tonic in each other's faces as we recited his alliterated lines, careless of any night but that. There, by the lago, the carelessness of that night seemed distant and the proximity of the poetry now immense. There had been puma sightings in the area around the hostel, so we gringos were advised to stay out of the forest at night. Our whiteness was of particular interest to the beasts. I would hang in my straw knit hammock, suspended in between earth and space. The warm breeze of the tropical nights lent an otherworldliness to it all, the moonlight filtering through the thick air. My hammock was just far enough from the jungle's edges to feel safe, and yet not so far that I felt entirely composed, unconcerned with the cracking of a twig or the ambitious hoot of an owl. There was an unsettled feeling of it all, and I read quietly, mouthing the words of the poems, just enough to get the taste of them on my labials, dentals, and glottals. A dark fur that treads the jungle on musical feet, monastic, in the delicate world, a thread of lusts on the margin, turning back, he touches the leaves in the blaze of his hungers, his eyeballs, a jungle of alcohol, burn in his head. Part 3. A week later, when I saw Jesus Dario event for the first time, he was shouting his poetry into a sensitive mic, distorting the words purposefully, insisting to the poor administrator in charge of the PA that the volume would remain exactly where it was. The boxy auditorium was the only colorless place in La Virgen, lit like a hospital, with pale walls that used to be white. Words should be sharp-edged, he yelled, crackled and overdriven. Jesus' erratic behavior made his readings more like theatrical performances, and word of the event had spread as far as the hostel where I stayed. It was nothing to travel 8 hours to hear him read, the serendipity of the timing not lost on my theological mind. The magic of those nights floating in my hammock while the darkness prowled in the jungle more than balanced the banality of the crowded bus. During the performance, Jesus kept backing himself and the mic stand further into the folds of the ochre velvet drapes behind the stage. His mask more than supported his cavernous breath, his neck a conduit of legendary proportion. But his movements were jerky and swift, like he could unshackle himself from the earth and disappear, become only a voice, scratchy and popping. Many doors were opening in his mind, some perhaps without hinges, not meant to be opened. In his mind there seemed no distance at all between the cupped and shivering pelvis of a woman in labor and the heaving of a galleon in the terrific black waves of a Caribbean storm, or between the child coming into its new existence in the afterbirth fluids and a bee drowned in its own honey. I would have liked to read his poetic treatment of Bogey's head. I approached him afterwards, crouched and stooped at the signature table. It was an antique walnut piece of tiny proportions, making his already large frame seem outsized and bulking. His head was massive, suited to his stout, legendary neck, but which came first? His hands, a tangle of scars and energy, creeping this way and that across the table as he sat. "I'm not like you," he said in Spanish with a smile, but not without direction, or jute, as I reached out to take his hand. "Nobody is," I replied, with as much confidence as I could muster before his unsettling figure. I held out his new collection of poems for him to sign, like a child trying to be tough around the Boy Scout fire. I was sure I saw his nostril flare, and that his first movement towards grabbing the pen and the book was jerky, as if it would extend further, like what he really wanted to do was to jump out of his chair and scare the shit out of me. Instead, he signed very slowly, in English. "Poetry redeems from decay the visitations of the divinity in man." Signing only Shelley. I grabbed the book and disappeared into the crowds waiting behind me. It was just a month after the reading that he disappeared. He never showed up to receive his rarely awarded literary medal. He left the generals, the diplomats, el presidente, waiting in the hot sun, the sweat creeping down their jowls past their collars, seeping in where their heavy metals lazed in the heat. He has since been seen all over Central America as a cross-dressing prostitute in Managua, as a lover of President Felipe Calderon's wife in Mexico, as a puppeteer in San Jose, but the truth was that no one knew where he had gone. I thought I might. I had been feeling that darkness again these 5 years later. The darkness in his poems, the darkness of the edge of the jungle, perhaps even the smoky darkness that pools in the corners of the Orthodox churches I had attended. The shadows underneath the lamps where the incense hangs heaviest and granite floors are coolest. Lately, it seemed to have settled somewhere above me, the black hangings just beyond my head, waiting to insert itself in the space I left. Gravity was on its side. I would tire before it did. Maybe Jesus got tired. Part 5. In the last year of my doctoral studies, walking became a way of life for me. I walked to think. I walked when I was tired and when I was too awake for the hour. The motion made me feel whole, as if as long as I kept moving, some centripetal mystery would hold me from collapsing out of orbit. I no longer believed what I studied and began to hide my shoddy work under layers of abstraction and theory. I'd misplaced my muse along the way, and nature and the celestial movements sang more to me of cool indifference than harmony or solace. I was trying to make a destination out of the journey, and so my walks were never long enough. I could never seem to get far enough from where I had started. One of these walks, a gray day to match my mood, I saw the familiar bulk of Leonard turning onto a one-way street ahead. I heard he had moved back home to his parents' house outside of Boston after his divorce. There was a child involved, and he wouldn't be seeing much of her. I shouted out to him. He turned a bit, but not enough to see me, hesitant to commit. I didn't call out again. Maybe if I had, we could have leaned into each other again, sharing the weight of the sermon the world was preaching at us in its strange language. More likely, we would have conjured our best smiles and most cutting sarcasm, overcompensating to meet the demands of the humorlessness of our lives. I'd love to tell a dramatic conclusion to my life of faith, but there wasn't one. Maybe the facts just added up, or as my physicality became more prevalent with its little aches and pains, I no longer had the will to live a life at odds with my flesh. Or, after years of increasing intervals between sex and conversations, she slipped out the back door and walked away, my faith. There was the unsettling robbery in Managua that rainy night 5 years before, and the excited discomfort of hanging in the jungle hammock and reading the words of Jesus to stay the puma. There were the shaky years of failed relationships, the shedding of my cassock. There were the doctrinally challenging semesters of my Harvard PhD in divinity, the most atheistic place on earth. But there was no great unhinging, no hero's struggle, no Ilosha or Ivan. The spring turned slowly into fall. The road less traveled petered out into the sunset. So I took the other. "Why do you believe anything at all?" she'd asked me, my most recent failed relationship. There was no rain outside, but there should have been, the moisture dense and palpable as it was. We had our last argument, if you could call it that, and the moment demanded cinematic downpours. But we were like fog, full of moisture, too spread out to rain. The porch was in need of painting, the colonial sculpted posts and rail spindles peeling as they seemed to do every year. I saw her mouthing words I'd never hear and didn't want to. I watched her brown curls bouncing like religious tassels from the church I had just left, or like the graduation cap I had just worn in the Cambridge fields. I stood for hours, well practiced, listening to the sermon. Part 6. The sexual liberation of my newfound non-belief became old quite quickly. Older quite quickly than I would have preferred. There were only so many possible combinations of flesh on flesh, and my lingering orthodox conscience disallowed the pervert in me from branching out. I ended up finding more pleasure, anyway, after the shitty and wonderful lay. It didn't matter which, in the liminal wandering through the dark streets of some new place. I was trying to chase the old out of the new, but maybe I was walking in the wrong direction. I had to keep going to find out. One such night, I wandered down the old carpeted stairway, they're all the same, and out into the Alston streets. I put on my headphones and walked for an hour, or forever, through the streets, puddled from that afternoon's rain. Even if the stairways were all the same, at least they dumped you out onto different streets. I made a turn and then another. A vague scent triggered a memory, and I froze on some invisible threshold. The music hadn't stopped, but it felt like it had. There were no teen somethings blocking my way or gesturing for my wallet, but it felt like there were. The edges of the concrete jungle loomed around me. No umbrella to shield me from the exposure or hammock to lift my body from the ground. There were no predators in the night, no hidden weapons, and that was the worst of all. Part 7. There was no Cambridge colonial porch, but it was raining when Bogey and I had our falling out. Bogey had been in Nicaragua these last 5 years since we finished at the Orthodox Seminary, running a small mission not far from the Lago in Nicaragua. In this version of a breakup, it was a letter that I held, not the hand of my wife, and it was the torn seal of the envelope dangling, not her brown curls. And the sermon wasn't spoken, but embodied in the letter from his mission. I'd become accustomed to the sterile, semi-annual mailings, the ones with the stutter-toothed children with the most symmetrical faces up front, gathered around Todd. But this time, the mailing wasn't just a reminder of the different paths I could have walked, a nostalgic bump on my road, as before. Todd's tilted, tiny head looked so fragile, like an offering made for me, and his expression belied some embarrassment at having to make it, at me knowing that he felt embarrassed at having to make it. The children's faces staring back at me seemed less smiley, more like the missing teeth were their adult teeth and wouldn't grow back. And it seemed like there must be a relentless schoolmaster standing just outside a frame with a stiff ruler admonishing them mercilessly to smile, no matter what they saw in the distance through the wormhole of the lens. Me, on a stoop in Cambridge in the rain. Part 7. It was a long night. The incense too damp to burn, my entire being limp. The shadows in my room sniffed the soft parts of my neck. I didn't feel like walking. There wasn't anything left to walk away from. Coffee was my only reason to live the next morning. On the ground in the kitchen, I saw Todd's card, face down, where I dropped it the night before. There was Todd's distinct scribbling on the back. We think Jesus Dario is living in a dump bordering our mission. The children have seen him. I've seen him. Unless there's some other enormous neck crazy man wandering around yelling poetic slanders, it's Jesus. He only comes out at night. The machete he carries keeps us from getting close, but he doesn't seem to want to bother us, so we don't bother him. For me, the idea that this mysterious figure in the dump could be Jesus was a rock in troubled waters. I booked my one-way ticket. It seemed the dramatic thing to do. I'd been dropping breadcrumbs, but the jungle had swallowed them as quickly as I had laid them down, and I had no idea how to make my way back out. Jesus in the dump was a small rise behind the enemy lines upon which I would raise my flag. Part 9. There were nights when Todd and I would stand for hours staring into the stillness that hung above the trash heaps. Some nights we'd see a distant light of flaming garbage in the expanse of the dump, one that Jesus lit when the night became too dark even for him. There was no doubting the hulking, swift silhouette of Jesus against the piles of trash and the flashing of the fires. Imagined or not, there was a palpable sense that he was looking down on all of us all the while. He must have accepted our presence, for the fires increased, joining forces with their smoldering ancestors of the previous nocturne. Eventually, they linked with each other in a wandering iconostasis of black and orange, a sanctuary of putrid incense. We'd read from my tattered, missigned copy of Jesus' poetry by the light of the burning trash, trading poems till our goosebumps gave way to exhaustion, or our eyes gave out from smoke and squinting. From nowhere, Jesus would appear in the center of his fire rings, and there spend the nights. During these nights, Todd and I would reflect on our years at the seminary. He admitted he'd always felt insecure around Leonard's brusque confidence. He asked me if I remembered Leonard's silence on the car ride home from Nyack the night we water wrestled in the Hudson. No, I said. In the exotic jungle of flaming plastic, catching up seemed petty. We would walk the length of the trail from his mission to the expansive dump in silence, and stand there in quiet amongst the hissing garbage and the sounds that fill the jungle at dark. On the first night, we saw Jesus appear in the ring of fire. Todd reached over and put his hand on my arm, just below the shoulder. The touch was soft and his fingers damp on my skin. I didn't shrug him off, but the gesture was never repeated. After a week of our standing homages in the dump, a marked change came over Jesus. He seemed restless in his ring of fire, as if some new phase of the ritual were about to begin. He would stand tall and fierce in his circle, staring out over the flames in our direction beyond us. He stood with his outstretched arms as if facing a bear, looking through us and yelling out his distorted incantations into the smoke-filled jungle. On the third night, as we grew accustomed to the new madness of Jesus, and his yelping had pitched into howls, it ceased. And he slipped out of the ring of fire as if whatever it was finished. He'd cast out his demons and went off into the trash for new ones. Todd and I maintained our standing vigil of silence until well past the apex of the three-quarters moon, further into the morning than we were accustomed to. The jungle was quieter than usual on our walk back to the mission. The bright light from the moon dimmed the confidence of the noisemakers. Where the trail wound its way near the lago, we froze at a loud snapping of branches to our right. I don't remember if Todd's scream came first or the roar of the puma. It was quieter than you'd imagine. Their struggle in the sand, where the water met the beach. I ran fast into the jungle, the oversized leaves slapping my skin as I flew into the hot, wet dark. A precision of feeling, the moisture in the veins of leaves defined against my arms and the sides of my legs as they whipped my skin. My eyes burned in my head to some new heights of attunement, something insatiable. I don't remember turning around. Maybe I ran in a circle. I don't remember the feeling of the dark fur as I thrashed it with my hands. I was far away. I was thinking of how Todd touched me on the scars of my shoulder where the Managua boy smashed the bottle, or how Jesus had been protecting himself from the puma in the ring of fire, warning us or saving us in his own way with the fierce howls. Of Bogey dropping the football and leaving the field. Of my last lover in a Russian veil at an Orthodox wedding. Of the three swimmers in the Hudson, boys in the suits of men. As the puma and I rolled deeper into the lago, I felt little drips of my life slipping away, of the inevitability of my losing this battle, the only battle. I couldn't hold his weight above me. I stopped trying. There was a shift in the light and the water, some new presence, a force gathering. The weight never dropped. I remember thinking it was amazing that Todd had roused himself from his bloodied heap, that he was strong and courageous as he grappled with the puma under the waters of the great lago. Where had he hidden such reserves of strength? And where did he get that machete? Part 10. I lay with Bogey where the waters met the sand, enjoying the touch of the small waves against my wounds. I was imagining that each new crest renewed me, while the recessions of water dragged away some part of me I didn't need anymore. The jungle was alive with commotion. I didn't stir at the cracking of sticks or flinch at the scream of jungle frogs. Bogey hadn't moved for a long time, nor had I. Maybe if I didn't move, it was okay that he wasn't moving. The moon and the sun were trading off. There were scattered pages of Jesus poetry stuck to the sand or rippling in the crests and troughs of the lake. I watched Jesus and the puma on the beach of the lago where the waves had left them. He had lifted the darkness for me, taken the weight from my shoulders. Only the darkness was a puma, and me was someone I didn't know anymore. And if I stood again, the weight of my head would still be there on my shoulders. I let the waves take those thoughts from me, and I pictured us from above, 4 forms at the edge of the lago, inanimate and grounded, silhouetted on the sand in the gathering light of day. The end.